welcome back to our series Impossible Follows and to part 4. And in this series we are exploring what it means to follow God and to live in a way that sees the glorious realities of the kingdom of heaven break in all around us. Today I want to spend just a few moments speaking to you about one of the parts of our characters that I think every believer needs to develop if they want to live and experience the fullness of the life that Jesus promised to each of us. We talked last time about the importance of knowing our identity and being able to stand firm in that identity when it's challenged by things from our past, voices around us, and the enemy who comes against us. And our identity is key to following God, but so too is the character that we develop as we journey after him through all the ups and downs that life throws at us. And today I want to focus on just one aspect of your character that I believe can equip you with the ability to push into a place where the impossibilities of God begin to manifest around you. Today I want to speak to you about courage. I believe that every Christian is called to cultivate a courageous attitude towards life. In fact, even more than that, I think we're not only called, we are commanded to be courageous. And courage is so important for us as we journey throughout our lives. I believe that faith allows us to see in advance that which courage has the power to carry us into. Or in other words, if faith is what builds a bridge between who we see in the mirror today and who God has created us to become, courage is what carries us across that bridge. Now, when we go to the Bible and we begin to consider the subject of courage, there's really only one person we can start with. We have to start with Joshua. Joshua was the leader of the Israelites who took over from Moses as they were about to enter into the promised land for the very first time. And Joshua was an Israelite who had lived in Egypt and was led out of that land following the first Passover. He'd witnessed how the plagues had ravaged Egypt. He'd seen the Red Sea parted. He'd lived on a diet of manna, literally being fed by heaven. He'd seen a rock split open to produce water and some other incredible miracles. What's more, Joshua had had a 40-year apprenticeship under Moses. He was exposed to the presence of God in incredibly powerful ways. Exodus 33 verse 11 tells us that the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp at his young age. Joshua would stay in the tent. Joshua was groomed for leadership throughout this period. He was being crafted, prepared and readied to lead the people after Moses died. It's interesting then that when the time came for Joshua to take that lead, that he received the same command 6 times from 3 different sources. And what was the command? Be strong and courageous. In Deuteronomy 31 verses 7 to 8, we see the first time he receives this command, and it's from Moses. And Moses says, Joshua, in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. So here is Moses giving Joshua the command. And again, we see in Deuteronomy 31:23 that this time it's God speaking. And he says in verse 23, the Lord gave this command to Joshua, son of Nun, be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land I promised them on oath, and I myself will be with you. Then again, this time after Moses dies, God again speaks to Joshua 3 times in 9 verses. It's recorded that God commanded Joshua, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Then finally, at the end of Joshua chapter 1, the people pledge their support to Joshua and agree to follow his leadership. Let's read Joshua 1 from verse 16. Then they answered Joshua, whatever you have commanded us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey it, whatever you may command, will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. Here we see the people vow to follow Joshua, just as they had done Moses. They'd seen this man being crafted and prepared to lead. They'd seen him spend the time in the tent of meeting in the presence of God. They knew he was one of only 2 men who'd been into the land before, and they pledged their loyalty to him. And the only thing they asked of him in return was to be strong and courageous. For Joshua, as he began this new stage in his life, he was moving into a place where he would have to follow God in a new way and at a new level. Everything that had gone before had been preparing him. But when the time came, the only way he could accomplish what God was calling him to do, to take possession of a land that was ruled over by giants who lived behind impenetrable walls, was to follow God in a way that would require him to be strong and courageous. And I think there is a lesson in all of this for us as we seek to live lives that, like Joshua, pursue God to see the impossible follow. You can have the best upbringing, the best mothers and fathers to raise you and to lead you, great past experiences of seeing God do impossible things, faith even that's been cultivated over years of relying on God to come through. But when push comes to shove and things go up a level, you better have courage. And it's not courage to dive headlong into the fight relying on your own strength to get you through. It's courage to believe that in the face of extreme opposition, God has promised to be with you, to never leave you or forsake you. And the Hebrew words for the phrase be strong and courageous mean to fasten onto, to be firm, to be resolute, to be set on something. The same word that's used for courage here is also used in Ruth chapter 1 verse 18, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. The same word that means determined is also translated courage. It means to be set on a course of action, to be set on a promise in a way that cannot be shaken. And so Joshua is being commanded, and we are likewise commanded, to be strong and courageous, to fasten onto, to stand firm in, and to determine not to be afraid or discouraged, because God will neither leave us nor forsake us. And the same promise God gave to Joshua, he gives to us through Jesus when he said in Matthew 28:20, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So as we seek to live a life that follows God's design and to run after him with everything we have, one thing we know we're going to need is the courage to fasten on to the promise that God will never leave us. And it can be difficult to operate in that level of courage, especially when you are faced with opposition. But I want to show you how. When you choose courage, you position yourself to operate at a place that expects and anticipates God moving in ways that to us may seem impossible. When the Israelites crossed over into the promised land, they weren't walking into an empty land ready to be inhabited. They were crossing into a land that was occupied by a strong, powerful, and warlike people who weren't just going to sit by and let the Israelites take over. The Israelites were crossing into a place where they were going to need to fight. Yet another reason why Joshua would require courage. As they cross into the land, God leads the Israelites across the River Jordan in a miraculous crossing that recalls the crossing of the Red Sea. And then the Israelites find themselves faced with their first obstacle, the fortified city of Jericho, whose walls could not be penetrated by any weapon that the Israelites have. And as Joshua muses over how the people are going to take this city, he meets a person the Bible describes as the commander of the armies of the Lord. And it's from this character that Joshua receives the battle plan. The people are to march around the city once a day for 6 days in silence. And on the 7th day, they're to march around the city 7 times. And we'll pick up the story now on the 7th day in Joshua chapter 6 from verse 15. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. Except on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. So Joshua and the people are victorious that day as they obediently followed the instruction of God. They believed what God had spoken to them and, with courage, carried out the plan to see God's purpose come to pass and the impossible happen. But look what happens next in the story. In chapter 7, we're told that one of the men of Israel, Achan, has, unbeknownst to Joshua, taken some of the plunder out of Jericho that was devoted to God and hidden it away for himself. And in the meantime, Joshua has already instructed the army to move on to the much smaller, much easier target of the city of Ai. The scouts have gone up and advised Joshua that he doesn't even need to send the whole army. About 3,000 men should be enough to take this city. But then in Joshua chapter 7, verse 4, we read this. "So about 3,000 went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, 'Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name?' So the Israelites are routed. They suffer a setback, and despite seeing the Jordan River dry up miraculously, despite seeing the walls of Jericho come tumbling down without an arrow being loosed, the people lose courage and become afraid of the opposition. Even Joshua, who had seen all that he had seen, who had been commissioned by God, by Moses and the people, even Joshua, who had been told over and over again, be strong and courageous, even he loses that courage. That firmness, that resoluteness, that fastening on to what God has said has melted away because of this setback. And Joshua rushes into God's presence and begins to ask, God, what is happening here? Why are you doing this? It's almost like he begins to accuse God. Why did you bring us across the Jordan for the Amorites to destroy us? He continues, what can I do now? What can I say to the people who are destined to be destroyed when the enemy hears about this defeat? It's like he's forgetting everything he's ever known and seen. Everything he's ever heard God say seems to have been drowned out by the defeat he's just suffered. His courage has melted, and he fears that the God who promised to never leave him has done just that. I wonder, have you ever had that experience where somehow it seems that what God has spoken is now being contradicted by the circumstances around you? I would bet that if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you've experienced something just like this. But this is why courage is so important, because watch God's response to Joshua here in verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them." God hasn't moved from his plan, promise, or path. It's the people who've deviated. They have violated the covenant agreement between them and God. It's like God has stayed on his course, and the disobedience of Achan has caused the Israelite people to deviate from that course, to stray from the path that God has been leading them on. It's like they've taken their hand out of God's. And see this, Joshua didn't even realize it was happening. That's how subtle it can be. And when they faced the enemy at Ai, they did it without God. And instead of fastening on to God's promise, instead of taking courage in God's promise, Joshua made an assumption that God had abandoned him, but he should have known that that was not the case. Isaiah 55 verse 11 tells us, "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." It can seem difficult when the situation is screaming at us that God has left us to believe in what he has spoken, but this is exactly why we're commanded to be strong and courageous. Because when we fasten on to what God has spoken, we can stand even in the middle of a contradiction and know that God is faithful. And when we stand with courage on what God has spoken, we position ourselves to walk in his path and see impossible follow. Let's go back to Joshua, because despite the fact that he began to operate out of fear and not in the courage God had commanded him to display, God has mercy on Joshua and instructs him as to what the issue is. Joshua then deals with Achan and then returns to Ai. He returns to the place of his defeat, and it takes courage to return to the place of a previous defeat. But now Joshua has learnt the lesson. Reminded again by God not to be afraid or to be discouraged, Joshua heads out, and following the instruction of God, he sets an ambush for the city and completely routs the enemy, destroying the city completely. And the Bible then records for us that Joshua and all the people renewed their covenant with God. They renewed their agreement. They renewed their courage in what God had spoken, and again devoted themselves and determined in themselves to follow where God was leading them. But the story doesn't end here, and Joshua's courage is about to be sorely tested again. But this time, we'll see what happens when you choose to stand firm, to be strong and courageous in the face of a circumstance that seems to contradict what God has spoken. Because while all this has been taking place, while Ai has been destroyed and Israel has renewed its courage, an enemy has been stirring. 5 kings from across the land have heard about what the Israelites have been doing, how they've subdued the cities of Jericho and now Ai, these 5 kings have banded together. They've joined forces to attack Israel's allies and to march upon Israel itself to utterly destroy the invaders. So Joshua, hearing of the attack, gathers the army and marches to meet the 5 kings in battle. As they approach the enemy, God again comes to Joshua and says to him in chapter 10, verse 8, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." And after an all-night forced march, Joshua and the armies of Israel fall upon the combined might of the armies of the 5 kings. And we're told that God threw the Amorites into confusion and they fled before Joshua. And as they run, God sends hailstones down upon them, and that more of them are killed by the hailstones than by the armies of Israel. A courageous victory by no small measure. But wait, because this is the moment when Joshua, I believe, shows us what real courage, what real fastening on to God's word looks like. Joshua 10, verse 12. "On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, 'Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon.' So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel." This is the moment, I believe, that Joshua stepped into the command to be strong and courageous with everything he had. He resolved in himself determined himself and fastened himself on to what God had spoken, and with all the strength and courage he could muster, and in the earshot of everyone around him, raised his voice and dared to believe God for the impossible to happen. And the sun stood still in the sky. Because of his courage, because of his determination to pursue God and to believe every word he had spoken to him, Joshua positioned himself to see a day the likes of which had never been seen before and has never been seen since. That is the power of courage. And this is the same command we have today. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, because the Lord will be with you wherever you go. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be with you always until the very end of the age. And as we seek to live lives that chase after God and what he has spoken with everything that we have, we may well come up against situations that can, on the surface, seem to speak louder than the promise he has given us. Situations to us that look like huge canyons before us, that present an almost impassable obstacle to our journey after God. But when we're faced with those situations, let us remember, faith builds a bridge and courage carries us across. Today, as you step out in your life and pursue God with everything you have, I charge you with the same command God gave Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, because as a son or daughter of heaven, you are an heir to the same promise that Joshua possessed. The Lord will be with you wherever you go. And as you go, I want to encourage you to follow God with everything that you have, because where God leads, impossible follows. I'll see you next time.
If you've enjoyed this video, we'd really love you to head over to our website and connect with us. At Life Church, we've created The Journey, which is a great place to begin your journey with God or to find out more. We want to help you, resource you, encourage you, and equip you so that you can discover who God created you to be. As well as that, you can find out more about everything we do on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We look forward to hearing from you.